What's up folks, it's Chili here. Over the past few days I got a chance to try out a preview for the Sultans Ascend expansion for AOE4. It was a ton of fun, and let me start out by saying that I am so excited to be entering the golden age of AOE4 with you guys. In this video I want to give a review of everything I played and discuss what worked really well with the expansion and things that also could have been a little bit better. As always, like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me, and without further ado, let's get right into it. First off, let's talk about the huge patch that will be coming with the expansion. This affects all players who have the game, even if they didn't get the expansion. The new wall fixes are huge, and I'm so glad to finally see this in the main game. Walls work smoother than ever before, and they can be connected to allied walls, and they aren't as finicky to place, and they can go over natural resources. From the perspective of an AOE4 player, this is so great. But if you're not an AOE4 fan, and you're someone coming from outside, this is a shockingly late fix. These issues have been persistent since the game's launch 2 years ago, and it didn't get fixed until now. So personally, while I welcome this fix, I still recognize that it should have been here a lot sooner. We'll also be getting a bunch of new maps, as well as a Japanese spring biome. The biome's an easy win, looks beautiful, easily the prettiest biome in the game, and I personally don't care too much about biomes, but they've definitely had some misses in the past, so I'm glad this one looks so clean. Now, the maps are a bit interesting. There's a tendency in AOE4 for a lot of the maps to have very gimmicky metas, that if you play the map a lot, you know exactly how you're supposed to play on that map, and they have specific things that you're supposed to do to win. So for instance, in Oasis, you're supposed to know that you have to chop through the forest to get to the sacred site in the water in the middle. I mean, now we don't have chop through anymore, so that won't be as much of a problem, but a lot of maps kind of play to their own specific way. And in my opinion, that's really bad for new players coming into the game who don't know the meta, and they just get absolutely stomped. Unfortunately, a lot of these new maps seem to play with their own very specific mechanics, so I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of these maps coming in. In the future, I hope that some of these maps can be restricted to higher level or pro play, while lower level players and newcomers can focus on simpler maps. On to expansion specific additions. The big new hotness is the two new fully fledged civilizations, the Byzantines and the Japanese. At this point, you have undoubtedly seen a ton of videos going over all of their unique mechanics, and I gotta say the hype is very much warranted. With these civs, the devs have knocked it out of the park. I've been messing around with my own civ designs. In fact, I specifically posted a couple vids covering what I'd want to see in a Byzantine and in a Japanese faction, and the official versions have honestly exceeded my expectations. The Japanese are one of the most original civs in the game. Tons of unique units with a lot of exciting new mechanics. We got unique animations for katanas and naganatas, we got badass warrior women, and samurai with deflective armor. On a thematic note, there are some historical misses. I don't think Japan would have been one of my top choices for a faction with deflective armor, and the faction seems to have really strong cavalry, which historically just wasn't the case. But here we are, you can't win them all. My favorite part about the Japanese is that their house functions as a food drop-off site. This goes back to that emergent design element that I discussed in the past. Since Japanese houses function as food drop-offs, you're quietly incentivized to build new houses with your hunters or berry gatherers. Japanese bases will naturally therefore be spread out as a result, which synergizes well with their fast-moving and aggressive military. This also has the added effect of making their house placement resemble the shrines of AOE3. Aside from just the samurai, the unique units in this faction are extremely fun. The shinobi especially, their stalker-like blink ability is absolutely hilarious, and I can just imagine the shenanigans that are going to happen with this unit. The audio work for Japan is also top-notch. The voice acting is bar none, probably the best in the game, especially the Japanese hand cannoneer. That voice actor went crazy. Oh, that's so sick! And the music that this faction has just transports me into a different dimension. Woo, that music! Whoa, so fancy. The same can also be said for the Byzantines. Not only is the music amazing, but I was straight up giddy when I first heard the Byzantine villagers saying Malista and Ne. If someone said Prostagma, I probably would have fainted. The Byzantines have the prettiest bases in the game. The cistern and the aqueduct mechanic is so close to what I had designed that I honestly wonder if the devs check out my concepts. I love the way the base building mechanic works. It's one of the few factions in the games where you just feel like you really accomplished something wonderful as you plan out your base. Basically, cisterns boost villagers and buildings around them, and they have to be placed a certain distance away from each other. Their cisterns can be connected by aqueducts, and the more cisterns that you have connected in the same network, the more of a boost you'll get. And you really get a sense of achievement when you manage to connect all 5 cisterns into the same network. The Byzantine landmarks and units are also very pretty with a lot of unique mechanics added in, and I'm especially happy with how powerful and unique the cataphracts are. I am, however, not a fan of the mercenary mechanic, which is probably the second most important Byzantine mechanic. The Byzantines can farm olive oil, which can then be used for recruiting mercs. Building your mercenary camp next to neutral trade outposts will give you even more map-specific options regarding mercenaries, which is quite reminiscent of of AOE3 actually. That's something that's kind of cute. So far so good for the most part. The Byzantines were famous for their employment of many mercenary armies, be they from Spain, Russia, Bulgaria, Genoa, the Cumans, etc. But the mercenaries that they have in the game are just so random. They're the unique units of other factions like Chinese Druganu and Delhi war elephants and Malian javelin throwers. These are cultures that had almost no contact with the Byzantines. Why would we be able to hire mercenaries from them? What's more, their H4 landmark allows them to recruit French royal cannons, the Chinese nest of bees, and the Mongol Hui Hui Pao. Just random, strong siege weapons from other civs. It's super weird, super arbitrary, and it makes the late game Byzantine army look more like a mishmash of a bunch of other civilizations' units than the proper Roman military that you'd want to see them with. It just takes me out of that Byzantine fantasy is all. Lastly, the Chirosiphons and flame projectile trebuchets are neat, but the fire doesn't actually do that much damage in reality, so the impact is not that great. We'll also be getting 4 variant civs in this expansion, and there's been quite a bit of controversy around these civs. They're not really historically based, or at least they're very liberal with their approach to historical inspiration, and none of them are the civs that we as a community really wanted to see added, save for the Ayyubids. Once you see them in game though, a lot of these worries just go right out the window. I originally thought that the variant civs were going to be listed straight on the same hierarchical level as the base civs, which would cause a ton of confusion. I'm happy to say that the variant civs are instead listed as sub-factions underneath the base faction. This may seem like a small visual nitpick, but it makes a huge difference when it comes to how players will interpret and understand these factions. Variant civs should only be thought of as sort of new civs. They'll play differently, yes, oftentimes very differently in fact, but they will share the same architecture, voice lines, music, etc. In a way, I think variants should be thought of as skins for the base civ. And after playing the variants, they all have a ton of thematic overlap with the base faction. Jeanne d'Arc is still functionally the French, and the Order of the Dragon is still functionally the Holy Roman Empire. But if you think of these variants as skins and understand that they are meant to have thematic overlap, then all the past complaints become much less egregious. It also explains why we don't see some of the more perhaps obvious fan favorites like Teutonic Knights or the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as they may be saving such factions for more fully fledged civilizations in the future. Picking relatively obscure or seemingly random factions to base civs off of is perhaps just a starting place, so that they don't step on the toes of future plans. The first variant I tried was the Order of the Dragon. This civ is a variant of the Holy Roman Empire. They represent an elite militaristic order and feature bigger, more expensive units. Aesthetically, this is HRE's cooler cousin. Most of their landmarks are the same, but the gameplay plays out very differently. This is mainly because the Order of the Dragon lacks the villager buffing prelate. But honestly, aside from that, a lot of the base HRE mechanics are still here. You still like relics, you still like building outposts, you still like men-at-arms and lance connects, but you do have a few key differences. Lance connect can get upgraded with these cool, well, the game calls them halberds, but they're clearly Volgeurs, and it makes them look really distinct. And come to think of it, I'm kind of surprised that for a game covering the medieval time period, we haven't had a proper halberd unit in the game. Their men-at-arms are also stuck on the sword and board. They won't be wielding those big two-handed maces anymore. And their crossbows for some reason have a bonus against siege weapons. I don't really understand what the point of that is. Overall, I appreciate this variant. It's a really fun and refreshing take on a variant civ. It isn't too hard to understand while also vastly diversifying the playstyle. I give it a thumbs up. Next, I tried Jeanne d'Arc. I really didn't know what to expect from the civ initially. Having tried playing it now, I'm still trying to figure everything out. It seems like a very different playstyle compared to your standard French. On paper, Jeanne d'Arc has very similar mechanics to baseline France. They both have the same mechanics, the same units, Royal Knights, Arbalètriers, and both factions have the exact same landmarks. But the main difference here is Jeanne d'Arc herself. And just like in history, her presence changes everything. Jeanne d'Arc is like a MOBA character. She even literally has Q, W, E, and R abilities. She gains EXP for taking actions, and you even see experience points counters come up when she or an ally kills a nearby enemy. She starts out as a villager, gaining EXP from gathering and building things. Once she levels up to a fighter, she can no longer gain EXP from gathering, so you're incentivized to do a lot of early aggression. But you specifically want to fight with Jeanne, which means you can't just be doing the French knight raiding thing all over the map. One absolutely humongous difference though is the fact that the Jeanne faction is the only civ in the game that seems to have no influence system. Normally French keeps have this influence mechanic that reduces the cost of cavalry and archery units around them. Instead, Jeanne will have the ability to consecrate buildings, which permanently reduces unit costs at the building. This even applies to town centers. But to use this ability, she needs to build up charges, and to build up charges, she needs to stay alive, all while you put her in risky positions where she needs to gain EXP. This makes for a French faction that thematically still feels very French, but has much more of a focus around Jeanne d'Arc. And I gotta say, despite all the initial outrage of naming a civilization after a single person, I'm actually surprisingly charmed by this design. It's very unique. It'll play very differently in spite of relatively relatively few changes on paper. So long as we think of it as a Jeanne d'Arc skin for the French faction rather than as a Jeanne d'Arc civilization, this is a pretty good design. It opens up a lot of good design potential, and I personally hope that we'll get more Jeanne d'Arc style factions in the future. Next is Jushi's Legacy. I really hated on the naming initially, and now having tried them out, I'm still not a fan of the name. Unlike the other two factions, Jushi's Legacy doesn't really have a clear here's what makes them different thing. It's more of a combination of a bunch of different things. At its core, Jushi's Legacy is very much China 2.0. It's got all the same mechanics, Druganu, Palace Guards, the dynasties, imperial officials, etc., but it does a few things very differently. Palace Guards and Druganu are available much earlier, and the faction lacks defensive landmarks. No Great Wall Gatehouse, no Barbican of the Sun. The dynasty bonuses are also very different, meaning that you don't always have to bum rush Song Dynasty to get your boom started. What this does is open up a wealth of options for early game aggro and map control. In later stages of the game, Jushi gets a ton of bonuses for their imperial officials, including getting more of them, buffing what they can do, and this actually enables a gold economy that is purely funded by imperial officials, which can be interesting if you're cut off from gold. Their unique units, in my opinion though, are not as interesting. Instead of Fire Lances, they get the Yuan Riders, which are more raiding focused, and those Shaolin monks are actually quite hilarious. They pack a serious punch. Beat him up. Beat him up. The Imperial Guard though seem just like stronger lances. It's not that interesting. The kit bash landmarks that we saw aren't too big of an issue ultimately, but it's a bit weird that two of them have basically the exact same silhouette. All in all, this makes for a more aggressive China. I still don't like the name, and I'm a bit confused why this faction had to exist, but I appreciate that it plays differently, and I had a lot of fun playing it, and I think you guys will too. Lastly, I tried the Ayyubids. This is a really cool faction design. It's not as easy to understand as the first two, and again, on paper, the Ayyubids have a lot of overlap with the Abbasids. Both of them have the House of Wisdom, both of them have the Golden Age system, but the Ayyubid House of Wisdom works completely differently. Instead of 4 wings with additional technologies that boost up your civ, you'll have 2 options for each wing, and most of these options give you massive boosts, but rather specific to the short term. So instead of cheaper villagers, you get a one-time injection of villagers. Instead of cheaper age ups, you get a one-time cheaper age up that's also way faster. What this means is that the Ayyubids are much more of a tempo-based faction. They have very clear power spikes that are granted by their age up options, and playing this faction means relying on making big moves the moment you hit your power spikes. It makes for a very interesting playstyle. No other faction is quite so reliant on these brief power spikes. The unique units for the Ayyubids also feel really good. I was iffy on the Desert Raider at first, but it plays really nicely actually. It has one of the most lenient attack animations in the game, which means it's amazing at kiting. But at the same time, it's a slow camel unit, so the kiting doesn't feel too abusive. The star of the show, however, is that Tower of the Sultan. This thing costs 1,000 resources and fires arrows like a mobile keep. Its damage potential is humongous, and it even looks like it's set on fire when it's on low health. This unit makes for really exciting, pivotal final battles and late game all-ins. I'm really happy with the inclusion of a unit like this, and I can't wait to see it in multiplayer games. Finally, I want to talk briefly about the campaign. I played a few of the missions in AOE4's base campaign when I first got the game. I appreciated the effort shown in the high production value documentary style cutscenes, but ultimately it wasn't for me. The documentary style made me feel disconnected from what was happening in the game, and the history being discussed was a little bit too basic and vague. The cuts and editing also felt a little bit too showy, like it was trying to liven up an otherwise really boring topic, and it just left me wanting more. The campaign stages themselves were also very boring. The levels all felt like first drafts. Every mission was essentially a defend your base or a build up an army and go out and attack. So many other games delivered on much better campaigns, and I really wish AOE4 learned something from them. Age of Mythology had a stellar campaign with amazing characters, voice acting, and a narrative that was really quite compelling. StarCraft 2 had probably the best campaign of any RTS game I've ever played. Not only was there an amazing story with memorable characters, but you're also able to win upgrades and bonuses as you play through the levels that would permanently affect your faction. This allowed you to make your faction feel like it was your own. In contrast, I stopped playing the AOE4 campaign after just a handful of missions. And I'm sorry to say that the campaign in Sultans Ascend is only just a little bit better than the baseline AOE4 campaign. Instead of a documentary style, it has this animated storybook feel to it, with a narrator walking us through the history of what happened during the Crusades. It's a nice change in direction, and I actually prefer this to the base game's documentary style. It doesn't feel cheesy or forced, and the narrator does a great job. It does, however, lack for any kind of personality. There's no humor or emotions, no real stakes at play here. It's just here's what happened. You can tell that the mission designs got way more creative this time. It's not an endless slew of defend this area or build up an attack here anymore. Instead, there's much more interesting mission design, including a Company of Heroes style capture points map, a naval trade focus stage, a stealth mission stage, and a defend the choke point stage. I appreciate the creativity with the level layouts. It's done much better than what I saw in the past, but at the same time, it's still missing something where I just didn't have any fun. I got about 5 missions deep into the campaign, which is enough to get through about half the campaign missions, and there were many times the missions just kind of lulled or lacked for things happening, which resulted in me sitting around repeating the same actions over and over again. There's no arc, there's no pacing. The titular sultans are also just glorified aura units. They have no personality, no real oomph that makes me care about them. This is much like the baseline campaign, which is a bit of a disappointment. I was also disappointed at the lack of Ayyubid representation. Despite one of the playable campaign factions literally being called the Ayyubid Sultanate, it was really just an Abbasid reskin. In fact, the whole campaign seems to be just an Abbasid campaign. That being said, I didn't try out the later missions, so maybe the Ayyubids appeared there, but the fact that the literal in-campaign Ayyubids are not the Ayyubid faction variant, I mean, make it make sense. I really wish the devs would take a note from StarCraft here. RTS campaigns are the most compelling when 1, there's a narrative that's pulling us through the missions, and 2, there's some part of us that we can put into the civilization that we're playing, upgrade paths that we can choose, unique units that we can select from, unique mechanics, etc. I'd especially love to see an AOE4 campaign that takes advantage of AOE4's unique influence system. It seems so obvious to me that a slam dunk AOE4 campaign would be one that essentially allows us to build our own version of the Civ. We would have different options to choose from, different bonuses that we could use, maybe that would affect the influence mechanic or the buildings that we can build and how the units would work, which would allow us to craft and evolve our own Civ as we play through the campaign. So for example, for the Abbasids, maybe you could evolve your House of Wisdom over time. Initially, perhaps your Golden Age can only be connected to houses, and it only gives like a farming boost or something. But then as you progress through the campaign, you can unlock additional bonuses that affect your house as well as affects your Golden Age. Maybe archery ranges can count double towards your Golden Age, or villagers can drop off to houses that are connected to the Golden Age. Maybe you could unlock the ability for archers to mount on a horse or something like that. I don't know. Okay, with that said, let's just get into the final verdict. Number 1, this expansion is insanely cheap. Number 2, we finally got the wall fixes that we've been asking for a long time. Number 3, we get 2 fully fledged fan favorite civilizations that exceed all expectations. Number 4, we get a ton of new units and mechanics to play with, including ninjas. Number 5, 4 new variant civs that all play very uniquely. And number 6, a new campaign that tries a lot of new things. On the other hand, there's the bad. Number 1, there's the increasing AoE 3ification of AoE4, where there's increasingly too many unique units and mechanics, and just intricacies that just make it harder and harder for new players to get into the game. Number 2, the campaign, while being a step up compared to the baseline campaign, it just still wasn't fun for me. And number 3, there's a trend of increasing thematic overlap and redundancy, not only with the variants, but even in places that don't really need it, like with the Byzantines and their mercenaries. Overall, I give this expansion an A-. It's packed with amazing content at an unbelievable price, with some really exciting stuff that fans have been asking for a long time. Yes, some things could have been done a little bit better, but ultimately it's not a big deal compared to everything else coming in this expansion. I'm going to be out on vacation for the next couple weeks, so I'm going to be missing the opening weeks of multiplayer, which I'm really sad about, but I'm excited to see you guys online once the expansion comes out. That's all from me. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more AOE4 content. Stay frosty everyone, stay chilly.